Avec la sortie de la 5e édition du jeu de rôle originel, les développements de nouveaux jeux vidéo, Shadowrun Returns et Shadowrun Online, d'un jeu de cartes, Crossfire, ou encore d'un jeu de figurines, Sprawl Gangers, l'année 2013 aura bel et bien été placée sous le signe de Shadowrun. À l'occasion des salons Gen Con et Gamescom, nous avons pu nous entretenir avec Jason Hardy, actuel superviseur du jeu de rôle papier, Jan Wagner, directeur créatif du futur MMO Shadowrun Online, et surtout Jordan Weissman, celui par qui tout a commencé.
I was very inspired by the recent creation of cyberpunk books, William Gibson's Neuromancer and several other that I was very into. And so I started to work on a cyberpunk game. And then R. Talsorian Games, Mike Pondsmith came out with a game called Cyberpunk, and typically for Mike, it was a very good game. So I didn't want to do a cyberpunk game, having done such a good one. So I started thinking about what I could do that would be different and unique, that would take cyberpunk in a different direction rather than trying to do something kind of along the main lines of what had been done in the novels. And I started to think about the kind of contrast between cyberpunk and fantasy, and thought about the deep themes that are underlying cyberpunk. And as I started to think about it, I realized that cyberpunk to me was about the dehumanization of humanity, about both on the micro scale, about how humans had come to the conclusion that humanity was not good enough anymore and was injecting lots of technology into themselves, and on the macro scale, how governments were giving way to corporations, and so even our larger bodies had no concern for humanity anymore. And I contrasted that with fantasy, which is all about really nature and about bringing the elements of nature back to life, and thought that they would be an interesting juxtaposition if we could get them into the same game. So I started to look for a mythos, a way to introduce fantasy into the science fiction setting in a way that had some logic to it and felt right. My dad was a very large Mesoamerican archaeological fan, and so there were many books of Mayan and Inca and Aztec history around the house. And so I had read lots of those and really thought it was a fascinating environment. And I remembered the Mayan calendar had a concept called the long count, which was a 5,200 year cycle. And according to the Mayan calendar, every 5,200 years is a new world. And the next new world was going to happen in 2012. And that I thought was very cool. And maybe if I use that cycle of worlds and thought about that as how magic ebbed and flowed from the world on kind of a sine wave, that it could be an understanding that this ancient culture had predicted the return of magic, had known about the cycle of magic.
I think when people hear about it the first time, Shadowrun sounds like a bit of a weird mix. You know, you've got cyberpunk, you've got fantasy, and then you just put them together. It sounds like sort of a cheap thing. But I think what Shadowrun really managed is to create a world out of that is really, really special. It works with a lot of the archetypes and the prejudices and everything else that you get in any other fantasy game or any other modern game, but it combines them in a way that makes the world unique, and it allows to tell interesting new stories. A lot of the cyberpunk games, and if you look at cyberpunk books or as a movement, cyberpunk as a movement, it sort of had a very high point in the 90s, and then it sort of died down a bit. Because the topics are limited. Now you've got biopunk and other genres that are similar to them, but the topics themselves sort of, I'm not saying they're all told already, but sort of the core thing has been told. And through mixing magic and fantasy into it, the Shadowrun world constantly sort of renews itself, because you've got stuff happening that hasn't got anything. You've got a huge dragon fighting with Ads technology. You don't get that in another game. And that provides a fresh perspective, provides new input. I think that's one of the reasons why Shadowrun remains interesting when the interest in the pure cyberpunk genre sort of faded a bit.
Depuis ses débuts en 1989, Shadowrun a su évoluer, comme en témoigne la sortie de la 5e édition du jeu, qui apporte son lot de bouleversements tant au niveau du système de jeu que de l'univers.
We wanted to focus on the characters. We wanted their skills and their attributes to be what made them do awesome things, rather than their gear or their programs being what made them great. And we also wanted to focus on some of the danger and some of the trade-offs that come with Shadowrun. Shadowrun should be a very dangerous place where you have to make compromises in order to survive. And so we came up with the theme of everything has a price. And it's always been there in Shadowrun, but we kind of brought it more to the surface, that if you want to succeed, if you want to maintain your independence from the mega corporations, if you want to keep your soul at all, you're going to have to pay something for it. And so we had all these things that we thought would be fun to put into the game, and so 5th edition gave us a chance to do that. We could build in those themes, we could focus on the characters and give people a chance to really have fun, and if they succeeded at a mission, or if they made themselves prime runners, they'd know they'd accomplished something hard. They'd know they'd done something great because of the challenges we put into the game. The state of the 6th world is never great because there's too many forces working against it, but I think that's good for the 6th world. I think it's supposed to be a difficult place to live. Some of the changes we made involved just the corporations cracking down a little bit more, trying to control people more, and giving more reasons for Shadowrunners to try to fight for their independence. So they've tightened their grip on the Matrix. So hackers now have to work harder to stay independent, to get the information they want. We've introduced an interesting plot line at the end of 4th edition that is going to put a lot of paranoia, where people who used to be stable, who used to really be in charge of what they were doing, now are become erratic and unpredictable, and the reasons for that aren't clear. And so there's going to be a lot of, like I said, paranoia and guessing what's happening to the people, what's gone wrong, what's causing it, and what can people do about it. So between what we're working on and the browser-based game that'll be coming out hopefully later this year, Shadowrun Online, we're going to be developing that plot forward and ramping up that paranoia, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun for people to see where this is going.
When we talked to the guys at Catalyst, Jason Hardy and the others, we wanted to work with them actually on the story. So that's the reason why we want to be in the current setting, and that's also why we sort of switched to even 5th edition. When we started out, there was the 4th edition, and we are creating a campaign book, which sort of describes the setting that our game is set in, but it's also a campaign book for Shadowrun with quests, and this way we were able to influence the storyline of Shadowrun. So one of the things that we already announced in the Kickstarter, that our players basically can decide which one of the mega corporations will take a dive. And that's only possible in the current timeline. Also, I think it's a bit more interesting because in the old Shadowrun, Wi-Fi wasn't even invented. Social media weren't invented. And the vision of the 20s, 50s Shadowrun feels a bit like, I don't know, Jules Verne thought about the future. There's some truth to it, but some of it doesn't really ring true. And there's more opportunities now for people that don't know Shadowrun to get in touch with it.
Shadowrun Online sera également une occasion de faire découvrir aux joueurs une version futuriste et dystopique de Boston, ville peu développée jusqu'à maintenant au sein de la licence.
When we talked to Catalyst, we said we wanted a city that we can mess around with. So that's the one thing. We also wanted a city that houses headquarters for a mega corporation because it's important in our storyline. And we wanted a city that has a bit of a history with Shadowrun, but isn't really that exactly completely defined yet. Because otherwise we would run into a lot of problems where people go like, no, in Hamburg we know this is happening and why isn't it happening in your game? So we need a bit of freedom, but we also need a bit of history. That didn't leave too many other cities. And the next reason was then we wanted an American city. We're obviously not an American team. So as a European team, we've got a slightly harder time of connecting with American players. Simply, we can't do PR tours as well. We're not as present there. So if you take all these things together, it sort of narrows our selection. Then we want, and then Boston was really interesting. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening there in the past. There was a big crash, and we can take that history and actually connect to it.
Toutefois, malgré toute la bonne volonté des différentes équipes, on remarque que certains des projets ont pris du retard. Alors on se devait de poser la question. Où en est la campagne berlinoise pour Shadowrun Returns? Où sont Crossfire et Sprawlgangers?
Well, we're working on the next thing we're working on is the Berlin campaign, and we've moved the Berlin campaign back to January because we've heard from the community that they want a campaign that's on the size and scale of the Dead Man's Switch campaign that came out with the game, which is bigger than what we had anticipated. So that really we are going to respond to that. We're going to make it much bigger. It's going to be a 10 to 12 hour experience and have much more terrain and characters in it than what we originally anticipated. We hope that Berlin is successful enough that it produces an economic model that allows us to continue to create more environments, more places in the world, and more stories. We hope that allows us to keep enriching the editor so that the players themselves can create more stories. But we're really going to have to kind of see how the game performs before we know what's next for Shadowrun.
We're really excited about that because it has a cooperative element that a lot of deck building games don't have, but it also has a character advancement element that I haven't seen in a deck building game before. And since we love the idea of Shadowrunners getting stronger as they do things and as they succeed, I'm really excited to see this in a card game. And so that's on track. Yeah, that will be coming out later this year. Sprawl Gangers is also moving forward very nicely. It's going into its third playtest cycle now. So the rules are getting into a really polished state. We'll just make the final tweaks after this playtest cycle and then get the miniatures into production. We got a lot of great designs for the miniatures. So that will be coming out at some point next year.
Bref, l'année Shadowrun va déborder sur 2014. D'un autre côté, ça tombe bien, ce sera l'année du 25e anniversaire du jeu. Comment le créateur de cet univers explique-t-il cette longévité?
It amazes me that Shadowrun is turning 25 and Battletech is over 30. And how do I explain their longevity? I guess through a lot of luck and a lot of great attention by the fans. I mean, we've tried to do our best part, right? We really have tried to produce an ongoing storyline that remains engaging, that we keep planning farther ahead so that the story evolves in a way that keeps the situation fresh. But ultimately it comes down to the dedication and the imagination of the players that's really helped it stay alive for so many decades. It's been a wonderful experience all these years.